Trump continues his promise that he'll place tariffs on goods from Mexico if they don't do more to stem the tide of illegal immigrants crossing into America. But he has little or no support in Congress, including from his own party. What happens next in this game of chicken with America's southern neighbor? We're taking a look on this edition of PoliticKING. Welcome to PoliticKING. I'm Matthew Cook, in for Larry King. So President Trump is not backing down from his promise to impose tariffs on imports coming into the U.S. from Mexico if they don't join him in his efforts to stop the flow of illegal immigrants entering the U.S. Mexico is America's largest trading partner, and the president has virtually no support in Congress for his plan, including from the Republicans. So what happens next in this standoff? And who's going to blink first? Let's begin there with the political panel. They are George C., Republican strategist. He's in New York City. And in Bordentown, New Jersey, David Marie, Democratic strategist and former advisor to Barack Obama's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. George, David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Matthew.
Good to be with you, Matthew.
So let's start with these tariffs. 5% tariffs on all goods coming from Mexico. There's no GOP support for this. George, let's start with you. In your estimation, where does this game of chicken end?
Well, I'm in New York today, but I'm a Texan. And one thing I thought we all learned from World War II, from the Germans of all people, is you don't fight a two-front war at the same time. You take care of one thing at a time. And I want the Mexico distraction to go away as quickly as possible. Sure, we have issues with Mexico. Sure, when you share a multi-hundred-mile border with somebody, it can get complicated. But there are, as you stated previously, they're our #1 trading partner ahead of Canada, ahead of China. And the president mentioned while he was in the United Kingdom that they were #1. They're actually #7. And our trade with Mexico is actually much, much more balanced than it is with China. So mixing your metaphors between trade and immigration control and national security related to that, I think is a mistake. John Cornyn is a very dear old friend of mine who was #2 in the Senate until this year. And John Thune is the current #2 in the Senate. He's a friend of mine. I think they're going to act very, very rationally with respect to this, and they're going to push back really hard because it's not good public policy. And I think the Mexicans want to get this off the table quickly, too. And I think we'll get to some kind of rational resolution in short order. We can focus back on the real issue in trade, which is China, which has been lying, cheating, and stealing its way to unfair advantages in global trade for 3 decades now. And it's time for them to be brought to account. We're going to pay a price for it, but they're going to pay a much larger price until they come to the table again.
David, what do you think? Are Republicans going to be able to rein in Trump's barrage of decisions that are against his own party's interests? What's going to happen here? How does this play out?
Well, Matthew, I hate to generally agree with George because that's bad television, but I generally agree with George. Look, I think this is much more politics than policy. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't actually do much for the immigration issue because Mexico needs help on that. On Wednesday, there are people meeting around now talking about this issue. We'll see if progress has been made by Thursday, today, and we'll see how this all plays out. But listen, tariffs is not a great solution. I don't care what anyone says. I went to pretty good schools, studied economics at the Wharton School, London School of Economics. Tariffs end up punishing the country imposing tariffs. There's a tax dimension to it and a ramification, and countries start to game it out. So this doesn't make a lot of sense, and the Republican senators, aligned with the Democrats, isn't that funny, view it that way.
There's a new CNN poll that shows that a majority of Americans, 54%, think that Donald Trump is going to win again, despite all the shenanigans we've just been talking about. How is this possible that people still think he's going to win? I mean, if you compare this with Obama between his first and second term, more people believe that Trump is going to win now than thought Obama was going to win, and that was right after bin Laden's assassination. So you'd think that there would be more support or more confidence in Obama's win than Trump's, but yet still here we are, 54% think he's going to win. What do you make of that? David, let's start with you.
Well, let me jump in. I would say, Matthew, that I think he may win. And some of the smartest people that I know in politics think Trump is the favorite. I think he's the favorite. It's interesting because we've advised 19 winning global presidential campaigns. The question we find least helpful is who do you think is going to win? it's as opposed to who are you going to vote for and what's your level of support on that question. So in some ways, it's the horse race question we find not so helpful. I think the president looks strong, and he has controlled the dialogue. Now, I don't like, maybe George will disagree, I don't like the way he's controlled the dialogue so effectively. He tends to divide and foment anger and division, and he attacks the media. Those are his sort of go-to plays. But he does keep yanking, whether he's attacking Meghan Merkel, whether he's attacking Bette Midler, whether he's attacking John McCain. He does tend to grab a hold of the dialogue. It's going to be hard to run against Trump. Now, I think the counter argument is he's underwater in all kinds of states against Biden and various people in Pennsylvania, in Michigan. Biden's now ahead in Texas. Jimmy Carter was the last president, the last Democrat to win Texas. There's a lot of trouble. Ohio's about flat. There's a lot of trouble, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio being flat for the Trump campaign. Some people think he's a 40% president, and therefore he's vulnerable to Biden or someone else in the general election. I think Trump's going to be very hard to beat. He's definitely, I think, the favorite. He's the top dog.
George, let's hear your thoughts about this 54% of people think that Trump is going to win. Is this cynicism or is this actual support? What do you make of it?
It's a mixture of both, and we're so far out in front, no one has a clue who's going to win the next presidential election. But I'll tell you how I will look at the whole situation. Is you take around the 8 to 12 states that are in play at this point in the country, most of the rest are not even remotely in play, and you tell me within a month of the election which polling within those states is an average of that polling or within the margin of error, and I'll tell you what the odds are. The last election cycle, every single battleground state was within the margin of error, and yet most analysts were giving Hillary Clinton a 95% chance of winning. I got to do a tour of British universities talking about American politics, and I said I thought it was pretty close to 50-50 because of this margin of error issue. So I don't have any opinion on who's going to win until we get to that point, because most people don't really pay attention till then. One big eyebrow raiser for me, though, is what David said, is that the poll came out today. It's an admittedly Democratic-leaning poll, but it had Biden up 4 points on the president in Texas, and that is absolutely unheard of. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think the first reason is Biden is a rational, likable, he kind of looks like a Mr. Rogers of politics. He's someone you wouldn't mind having, except for the creepy pictures with the ladies, which is overdone. You'd have him on your front porch to have a glass of tea or lemonade or a beer or something like that, and Texans like that kind of person. And secondly, Texans are tired of the divisive, ugly, personal attacks and rhetoric the president goes to too often. Texans don't operate that way, and they don't like it. And most people missed that Mitt Romney beat President Obama in Texas by 17% in 2012, and yet Trump only won by 8 in Texas in 2016. And a big factor of this is the lack of being gracious towards your adversary. Tough, rough, they love that part of Trump, but gracious, and he just doesn't do that very often. And I think they better start paying a lot more attention to Texas, and they better stop trying to talk down oil and gas prices, because that's the lifeblood of Houston, Texas, and a lot of the oil-producing parts of Texas. And it's been very obvious the president is trying to crush oil and gas prices, and that's not popular either.
David, do you agree with everything George just said?
God, I mean, I really hate to agree with everything George just said, but I do. I think there's 3 issues that are coming at us. One, and George sort of alluded to this, are people just getting tired of Trump? Is there a fatigue factor? I mean, it's awfully hard to be overloaded on what did Trump tweet yesterday, today, 3.5 minutes ago. That's factor one. Factor two is we're 20 days out from the Democrats' first debate. We don't know how it's going to shake out. Does Biden win the nomination? I think, there's challenges, there's issues. He's certainly a very strong front runner at this point, but Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg can rise up because they're not well known and still popular. That's the second factor. The third factor, which none of us know, the three of us, what's this economy going to look like 8, 9, 10 months from now? Do long-term bond prices really show some danger signs for this economy? In some ways, that's going to be so critical, I think, to perceptions of Trump. That could become a tipping point one way or another, depending on what this economy looks like at that point.
What do you think about the Democratic candidates, the landscape right now? I mean, we've got a major division on the left. Biden obviously is the front runner, but he also voted for the Iraq War, a very unpopular issue, popular to be unpopular with the progressive left wing. He voted for the 1994 crime bill, also extremely unpopular with the progressive wing. His stance on Wall Street, we'll have to see about that. Is the Democratic Party more split than ever, and how's that going to affect the upcoming election? George.
I think in this soundbite ADD era that we live in, that people don't pay that much attention, but at the same time they process information a lot faster. And I think you're seeing that in the Democratic polling, where Vice President Biden has incredible name identification. He's a stable presence. He's a known commodity, and he is way out in front of the rest of that field. And if I were the rest of the field, I would be not recklessly, but viciously going after him right now, because I think opinions, even before the debates, unless he has a terrible debate, I think he's so far ahead that it might be really difficult for other people to catch up. And I think there's a rational element within the Democratic Party that at all costs wants to defeat the president, and they're going to go with whoever they think gives them the best chance to do that. And at least these incredibly early polls would point to the vice president, the former vice president, as the person to carry that out. So if I were the other cast of 20 or whatever it is that are running, I would have an all-out assault on Team Biden, because opinions may harden and he may just walk away with the nomination. And I would say two things back to what David was saying earlier. We don't know what the economy is going to be like in a year, and that's the president's biggest asset, and his biggest likelihood of getting reelected is the base loves his judges, and he's overseeing one of the greatest economies this country has ever seen. Now, the tariffs may mess it up. We may slow down. Who knows? But right now, that's a huge asset for him. And I want to point out one big weakness to me for Vice President Biden, even though I think he's a compelling candidate for the Democrats. He's really old, and he looks fragile compared to President Trump. I realize President Trump is no spring chicken either, but the vice president looks a little feeble to me. And if I were Kamala Harris and the mayor of South Bend and some of the other candidates on the Democratic side that have got a little bit of momentum but not much, I would try to paint a contrast of we're the youth, vigor, and energy of the future, and you need to look to us. You don't want to look to the past, and the vice president is the past. That's the way I would look at it.
George, David, thank you so much for your time today and for agreeing so much for a change. More politicking right after the break. Welcome back to Politicking. I'm Matthew Cook, sitting in for Larry King. In this era of deeply partisan politics, there's apparently one issue upon which the Democrats and Republicans are seemingly willing to work together, and that's launching an investigation into the business practices of tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Facebook. The latest investigation into the tech industry comes in the form of House Judiciary Committee antitrust probe. So what does this mean for Silicon Valley? And can Congress really deliver regulatory action for an industry it hasn't yet shown an ability to even fully understand? Let's turn to the legal experts to weigh in on that. They are Kendall Coffey, former U.S. Attorney with the Southern District of Florida. He's in Miami. And in New York, Misty Maris, trial attorney and legal analyst. Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
So, Misty, let's start with you. So, Monday, House Judiciary Committee announced it's launching an antitrust investigation into the nation's largest tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. What does antitrust mean? Let's start with that.
Antitrust in general means avoiding unfair competition. And I think it's excellent that these probes are going underway. One reason, it takes a while, notoriously, for the law to catch up with technology. And certainly, these tech giants have been around for a while, have been largely unregulated. And so now at this point, not only do we see this investigative probe, we also saw the Federal Trade Commission back in February get a committee together to really look at the business practices of these tech giants. So certainly this is a step in the right direction in determining, number one, whether or not there have been violations, but do the laws that we have on the books at this moment actually cover these the issues that are coming forth with the expansion of technology?
Kendall, your comments?
Well, the essence of this is seen broadly as control of the information about our lives, the massive accumulation of artificial intelligence, the very limited access to the information age because it's so dominated by by so few. The biggest question is going to be how, if at all, can this really be changed? Because traditionally, investigators such as the FTC and the DOJ are really trying to look at issues that violate existing laws. And a lot of the court decisions with respect to existing laws treat not so much the access of other competitors. That's certainly part of it. But they focus heavily sometimes on what is the impact on consumers. Are users, for example, of Facebook paying greater prices because of illegal practices by Facebook?
So
the
this
answer is it doesn't cost anything to get on Facebook.
Right. So this is really interesting because here we have, for the layman, it seems obvious that Facebook is a monopoly, right? It controls 1/3 of the entire planet, market share of the planet. We're talking about billions of people on Facebook, and there is nothing like Facebook. So from the layman perspective, it's clearly a monopoly. But this investigation, it's supposed to look into 3 areas: competition in digital markets, anti-competitive conduct, and dominant firms, and whether current laws are adequate. So let's start with, are the current laws and enforcement policies over these behemoths adequate? Misty.
Well, I think that really there needs to be some changes, and the first step that's being taken here by conducting these investigations and making these inquiries. And when I say investigations, I'm not talking about formal investigations to identify violations of the law. I'm talking about inquiries into the business practices. I think what we're going to see next, we're going to see testimony by giants on Silicon Valley. We're going to see documents relating to the corporate structures and corporate business practices. And by getting that information, Congress can then make a determination about where the holes in the law are. What we just heard, some excellent insight by the other guest, is that, look, a lot of this is focused on the consumer, but what does it mean for these tech giants who are monopolizing the industry from the layman's perspective? And that's where the law really needs to catch up. And I think some of the issues that have come up in general with privacy and cybersecurity issues are really shining the light on these problems.
Kendall, with regard to anti-competitive conduct of dominant firms, what does that mean? What are they referring to?
Well, they're going to have to find something that shows specific illegal practices to keep competitors out. For example, does Apple, which dominates the application world, are they doing things so that it's harder for somebody to get their application in through excessive pricing or through other limitings? It means that doing something more than just trying to be successful by marketing yourself as well as you can. And finding those kind of illegal practices is not so easy. We all recall famously the Department of Justice spent 13 years investigating IBM. IBM, like some of these other tech giants, seemed to be not just the king of the hill, but the only one on the hill. And yet, at the end of the day, they were not able to really establish a case. I think that if Congress gets really engaged and stays on this, they're going to find not only issues with respect to privacy, but a need to create stronger laws with specific limits so that somebody can get a hold of the tech giants. Otherwise, they are going to continue to grow and be more powerful, frankly, than anyone in Congress, individually or collectively.
So in your opinion, which of these tech giants is most guilty of this kind of anti-competitive conduct? Kendall?
Well, I think, I'm sorry,
go
ahead.
I'll just jump in and say, I don't think you can say any one of them. I think that certainly Apple's going to get a lot of scrutiny just because they're in so many places and control the application market. But it's hard to say that any of them are going to be found liable for anything at the end of this. They're going to be nervous for a while, but what's going to really have to happen is Congress needs to look at changing existing laws, or else we're all going to continue to feel that the tech giants are too popular. Why doesn't somebody do something about it? And the answer is going to be nobody can do anything about it under the existing laws.
Misty, you agree?
I definitely agree that to assess more culpability to any individual company, I don't think we can at this stage of the game. Maybe that will change as the probe continues. But I will say that using Google as an example, so back in 2011, there was an antitrust case against Google by the FTC. They were fined $22 million. Then another investigation unfolded in 2013. That didn't lead anywhere. And that, again, shows that pattern of having inadequate laws. But let's turn and look at the European Union, who's fined Google $9 billion with a B, dollars over the past 3 years. Now, here in the United States, there's a much more lenient view of free market, on market competition. And that's why we see such a dichotomy of results. And I think there's also been, in the past, a fear of stifling innovation and not really wanting to jump into the tech world because of that fear. But now, as social media, as these companies, as all of these the tech industry becomes more and more part of our everyday life, there's certainly a need to at least do what the FTC and the DOJ is doing, which is looking into these business practices and trying to figure out where there are vulnerabilities in the law. So will there be prosecutions based on what's happened so far? Maybe not, because of the current state of the law. But will there be a clear path moving forward? Well, hopefully Congress can get there.
So we had this amazing editorial that Chris Hughes, the co-founder of Facebook, wrote, where he said, we've got to break up the companies. We've talked about some of the bird's eye view political analysis, but I'd love to get your personal opinions. Should we break up Facebook? And
well,
how?
I'll jump in on that,
Yeah.
if it's okay, Matt, because I think that fines and investigations are chump change for a giant like Facebook. I think unless something happens structurally, nothing is going to seriously change or interfere with their long-term goals. And their long-term goals are greater presence, greater money, greater power.
Misty?
I definitely agree with that proposition, but I do think it's too soon to draw any conclusion about what the right thing to do is, whether it's to break up the company. I do agree fines are kind of, it's like pocket change to a certain extent. But before we go as far as breaking up some of these giants, there are other ways, there are other limitations that could be imposed if violations are found. So to me, I'm a lawyer. I'm all about, let me have all the information and then understand what the result should be.
Yeah, but like what? Like, how could we do it? Like, what could we do to create some semblance of competition in the social media world?
Well, I think right now the issue is that you have somebody like Facebook acquiring other, you have them Instagram, WhatsApp, basically any platform that is equivalent to Facebook. So you could limit some of those acquisitions. You could limit some of the terms that are in contracts. In fact, that was an issue in the case in the EU where consumers are essentially forced into contracts that they have to stipulate to these contracts that they have no control over. So there certainly could be limitations on some of those business practices before breaking up the companies.
I agree with both of you that more information needs to be found, but it just seems on a basic level that most people don't understand how to even begin talking about this. So how do we get educated enough to even begin to talk about what does it mean to break up Facebook? Most of the time, I think a lot of Americans think breaking up Facebook means somehow shutting them down or closing them down in one degree or another. But it actually means 1,000 different things. Breaking up the company could mean that you have 5 different Facebooks, but what does that mean? Do they control market territory? Do we have a West Coast Facebook and an East Coast Facebook? How does it work? How could it work to break up Facebook? Kendall?
Well, I think Misty correctly identified the starting point, which is future acquisitions. Instagram, WhatsApp, they're all now sort of gobbled up by Facebook. So that's part of the process. It's not breaking them up, but it's certainly slowing them down. And as we saw with AT&T, at the conclusion of those processes, they did create different territories. It may be that that's less feasible here, but on the other hand, that's got to be one of the things that's on the agenda for consideration.
I think one of the things that we'll have to end up talking about is open source, is somehow individuals owning their own social networks. So whether it's Facebook or Instagram or something else, that anyone can come into the marketplace and still own their own connections to their friends. And I think it's the monopoly on holding that data that really keeps Facebook in a position where no one can compete against them. But Kendall, Misty, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much.
And thank you for joining me on this edition of Politicking. And also thanks so much to Larry King for letting me sit in this chair today. Remember, we love hearing from you. Join the conversation on Larry's Facebook page. And as always, you can share your thoughts on Twitter by tweeting @KingsThings and using the PoliticKIng hashtag. I also invite you to join me on Facebook at Matthew Cook Official. And that's all for this edition of Politicking.